And yes, it's on. Welcome everybody to another episode of our webinar series. My name is Ali Komatu from Africa for Palestine. Today we are hosting Comrade Muhammed Khalid Sayed. Good afternoon, Comrade Khalid.
Good afternoon, Comrade Ali, and good afternoon to the viewers and to the membership as well of Africa for Palestine.
Oh, wonderful. How are you feeling today, Comrade Khalid?
No, all good, all good. Start of a new week, busy week ahead. So it's good that I'm starting off the week in a conversation with you guys. It sets the right tone for the week ahead.
Yeah, Comrade Khalid is in Cape Town. We saw, I think it was last week, there was something called a sea foam or ocean foam. Like the water was coming out of the ocean and onto the roads. How's the weather that side?
No, the weather's good. We're having a pleasant day today. We're having quite a pleasant day today. So
it's not as bad as last week.
It's not as bad as last week. Unfortunately, last week was quite bad, and it had quite a devastating effect as well on communities. So our spirit of solidarity had to come in as well last week. But it seems it's much better today. As you can see in the background, a pleasant day. No rain. Yeah, and I'm not wearing a jersey.
Okay, Comrade Khalid, let's get into it.
Yes.
So to our viewers, we are Africa for Palestine. We're a human rights solidarity organization primarily preoccupied with Palestinian human rights and solidarity in the African continent, and our head office is based in South Africa. We do Palestine advocacy work and awareness, solidarity work across the continent with specific focus in driving Israel's influence outside of the continent. We do work with very many various groups, religious formations, churches, mosques, brother civil society, trade union, political parties, and primarily many other organizations who identify with our cause. We partner with them, academics, cultural artists, and so on, that identify with the cause. And our work is done throughout the continent, and we have partners even outside the continent on the work that we do. From last month and this month as well, and we'll see what we do the coming month, but we've been having a webinar series where we have conversation with different leaders from different walks of life in Africa and beyond Africa as well. Today we have Muhammed Khalid Sayed, who is chairperson of the African National Congress Youth League in the province of the Western Cape of South Africa. He also serves as the member of the parliamentary legislature of that province. So today we'll be discussing the contribution of the youth and international solidarity per se. And we'll be diving into that, the rich history of the African National Congress in the continent, in South Africa, its contribution to the anti-apartheid movement, and so on. So I'm looking forward to a very informative conversation between myself and Comrade Khalid. Let's start. Comrade Muhammad, just briefly tell us who you are and tell us about the work that you do.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you've given quite an introduction already. So look, as you've indicated, I'm the provincial chairperson of the ANC Youth League in the Western Cape. I'm serving in my second term as the provincial chairperson. So I've worked very closely with the then, I think it was BDS, and various other solidarity formations. I'm very passionate about international solidarity struggles, but obviously because those struggles also speak to the struggles that one is also waging in our own country, and particularly in the Western Cape, a province which very much, even at the level of issues of race, of dispossession, of structural racism, one very much still feels that Black people are colonized in this province still. So the international struggles have thus resonated with myself. So in my capacity as the Youth League chair, and even before that as a convener of the ANC Youth League in the province, I've worked very much on struggles of international solidarity. I've also served as a public representative. I'm the Deputy Chief Whip of the ANC in the Western Cape Provincial Legislature with my and I'm the ANC spokesperson on education in the legislature. So I deal with issues of education, particularly focused on the struggle for equal and just education in our province in particular, but tying that into the country. I was a student activist as well, coming from the ranks of SASCO at the University of Cape Town, where also there I was part of various, in fact, I was part of an organization that we founded, very interestingly, the moment Israel started erecting a wall, the famous apartheid wall, we then formed our own organization called Stand Up. Stand Up Society. I'm not sure whether it is still in existence at UCT, I must check. And we actually built a wall on the then on Jamison Plaza, just to create sense of awareness. So it was also part of my activity. And then we went into, after that, I mean, we looked at other struggles as well. We looked at the issues in South Sudan. We looked at various others. But really, I mean, I'm very passionate about international solidarity and struggle, and drawing the linkages with our daily struggles in this country.
Thank you very much for that wholesome intro. Our understanding, and perhaps for also viewers who are not familiar with the history of South Africa, the African National Congress Youth League, it's a league of the African National Congress, the African National Congress of Mandela, Oliver Tambo, that was started in 1912, that led the resistance movement against apartheid and British colonization in Southern Africa, and became famous in the world. We know today that the African National Congress is the oldest the oldest liberation movement in the continent. So it boasts that history, it boasts that work that it did in the 1980s, the 1960s, 1970s. So it's got a world footprint, and I think if you ask somebody who's in Nigeria what they know about Mandela and the ANC, they would have an idea of what you're talking about. If you go into Asia, into India, and say Mandela, and ANC, they would understand what you're talking about. So is that still the case in terms of the work that has been done? Do you think that's the case? You still have that footprint in terms of being an internationally recognized organization that primarily champions human rights?
Thank you for that. I think it's good background that you've given. And actually, let me say that even in 1912, when the African National Congress, in the early days, when it was still seen as somewhat conservative in its approach, even then it was involved in the international space. Even the conservative move of going to meet with the British monarch meant that there was a sense of our struggle here is dependent on engagements outside of the country. The Youth League itself, I mean, one of the pillars in 1940, in 1940s, the ANC Youth League was established. And the program of action was put into motion in 1949. Was that of international work. Pillar number 5 of the Youth League was international work. We have Nelson Mandela, you spoke about, who spent time in Algeria, in Ethiopia, training. O.R. Tambo was one who was very clear on international struggles. He actually would be in the forefront not only of amassing international support for our struggle here, but international support for other struggles like Palestine. So I think that's a good context. In terms of the ANC, I think in ideologically still, policy-wise, still on course in terms of the international struggle. And I think at least from interactions I've had on the continent, interactions I've had in the Middle East, consistently, even interactions in Latin America and Cuba, the ANC is still respected as an international force of the global left, as an internationalist movement, because people understand its policies. They understand what the ANC is even trying to do, even within a context of our own challenges, even within an increasingly aggressive global context, where the right wing have really taken hold. But I will say, and I think we must be honest here, is that what has been happening in the past few years, at least, despite our sound policy positions, some of the real progressive moves we make at the global level, there has been, on the part of traditional allies, and I have experienced through some of the direct interactions that there's somewhat of a disappointment towards the ANC, particularly the ANC in government. There is, and we have to be open to that. And I think that speaks for me to the topic of the role of the young people in terms of internationalism. It means that young people need to start agitating. I'm glad to see Africa for Palestine, for example. It's many young people taking the fore. Yourself, Comrade Bram, Comrade Muhammad, many others. And I think it means that because our revolutionaries, our seniors have played a great part in terms of giving the ANC this internationalist character. But in time, obviously, they will tend to, not deliberately so, but they tend to get tired as well. There are those who are still pushing, but also they've got to deal with many other issues. I think it's important that it's young people that actually revive that spirit of the ANC at an international level to be completely dependable. I was surprised in Cuba last year when I attended the political school. There was an international solidarity conference that took place of liberation movements, and it was against imperialism. The ANC were not received as warmly as they normally would be received. We're not given that stature that they normally. Yes, we're not taking away, the stature is still there, but there are, I think, what many global progressive forces are increasingly aware of is the fact that at the level of the economy, we are becoming more and more dependent, or at least perceived to be more and more dependent on forces that are opposed to a progressive agenda internationally. So there's that fear. Are we going to be able to tread that? Are we, how are we able to manage that? So there is a fear there, which I think the younger generation needs to ensure that it dispels that myth entirely.
Thanks for that. Just taking from what you said, many would argue, and I believe that is a legitimate argument, they would argue that your organization, the ANC, has a moral obligation and you'll say a revolutionary debt to the international community for what the international community did for them during the struggle against apartheid. You mentioned that countries like Algeria, Ethiopia, Zambia, Angola, they gave the ANC camps, Tanzania, to train their leaders in exile. In Sweden, in Sweden they had something called an apartheid tax, where there's tax from the citizen going to the ANC. They had something similar in Nigeria as well, where citizens would be taxed and the money that tax is given to the ANC to operate in exile and so on. Do you believe that this is something the ANC is paying back revolutionary debt per se? To say, we've helped you, now you have your freedom, now it's your responsibility to help others elsewhere.
Look, it's a good question. I don't think we should view it necessarily as a debt or as a revolutionary debt. I think as Africans, firstly, who believe in the concept of Ubuntu, we would then, of course, know that our human solidarity actually arises from our understanding of Ubuntu. It's on our continent, and as Africans, we understand that our humaneness depends very much on the integrity and on upholding the humaneness of other human beings. So that's very important, not to see it in a commodified sense that these people helped us, now we must help them. It arises even if, because what are you then going to say in countries where there's a legitimate struggle for human rights and for that which is progressive, but they were not able to assist us? You see, so it doesn't necessarily, yes, it's important in the solidarity to show that we appreciate what these countries have done for us. But I think more so because countries in the world, even though like Sweden, for example, doesn't necessarily purely need our assistance now, but because countries in the world assisted us and assisted our struggle, a struggle which is actually still ongoing at a different level, it should speak to our revolutionary conscience, our spirit of solidarity, to say that we ought to not only help them, but help everyone else in need and who are suffering. Because we are part of a global village. We are human beings. It speaks to our very humanity as Africans. It speaks to the suffering that we underwent. But also beyond that, given the kind of, you see, because a just world, a just social order, it's also going to benefit us as South Africans, not only government or leaders, but it's going to benefit ordinary South Africans as well. So it's intertwined. Yes, our revolutionary spirit of solidarity important, indebtedness to a great extent, flowing from our sense of Ubuntu, whom we are. It's who we are to give a helping hand. And obviously in the revolutionary sense, we've read the works of Marx, Che Guevara, Chairman Mao, very, very clear. This is what lays the basis, Marxist-Leninism with African National Congress. Our leaders have spoken. Nelson Mandela had said, South Africa cannot be considered free until Palestine is free, for example. So that's there, but I think it even goes deeper than that. It speaks to our very sense of humanity and being. And then beyond that, a better world, a more just world, curbing the powers of imperialism and the powers of arrogance is actually even going to assist our own domestic development in this country.
Thank you for that. Interesting enough, Comrade Julius Nyerere, former president of Tanzania, says the African is born a socialist. It's in the fabric.
Exactly.
It's in the molecular fabric.
I was going to quote Mwalimu now on that, but no, perfect. African is born a socialist. That's
so it's inherent in the African man to give solidarity, to give a helping hand.
It's inherent. That's our culture.
So we're going to delve more specific to our viewers. So the ANC Youth League is a youth wing of the African National Congress, and in this country, it has a history of being radical. It has a history of speaking, speaking truth to power per se. It's been more vocal than the mother body on certain things, and I think the young people are given freedom more than the conservative older leaders in the organization. So we're going to speak specific on international causes that you have readily pronounced yourself on, defined yourself on, and we'll start with looks controversial, but the position on Western Sahara and Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara. We believe that Western Sahara is the only colony left in the African continent. So your organization is taking a position on that. Would you let us in on your position on that particular issue?
I think our position has been quite clear. Numerous Congress resolutions, even before the 2011 resolutions, and we have been even at the level of the Western Cape, we've been speaking, participated in programs in this regard, to say that we have been giving our full support, as our mother body has done. I must say, the mother body has also been very, very firm. Our full support to the Polisario and to the Sahrawi people. We support their aspirations for not only for an autonomous state, but for self-determination. We're not in support of the Moroccan imposed idea of a Bantustan, because what Morocco wants to do there is they want to, they're exerting pressure for the Sahrawi movement and the Polisario to accept a state of autonomy, but without self-determination. And that we are not going to accept, because it was not good enough for the South African majority. Bantustans were not good enough for us. It cannot be good enough for the people of Western Sahara. Bantustans are not good enough for the Palestinian people. I often tell my Moroccan colleagues and friends who say they are big supporters of the Palestinian struggle, but are very, very vociferous in opposing the African National Congress, the Youth League, and South Africa's stance on Morocco, to say, no, these are, the king is doing so much for Palestine. I say, no, it cannot be. You cannot be, because the reason we support Palestine, the reason we opposed apartheid South Africa, and the reason it's not purely human rights. It's about making sure that people can have the dignity of their land and running the affairs on their land. So it cannot be that we want to reduce the people of Western Sahara to a mere Bantustan, and that they must continue running. And yes, we recognize there is a government, but that government is running from exile. It's running from refugee camps in Algeria. So we are very clear. And when we are concerned at times, we understand that our elders as deployed in government need to take at times diplomatic positions. They need to drive the United Nations in a certain direction. But we will continue being a radical voice when we have seen at times that they are, in a sense, giving Morocco a bit of space to move and to maneuver, and allowing Morocco to get their way. But we need to pursue, we need to actually have much more focus and energy on this particular struggle.
Thank you for that. I think many of people who are involved in human rights work would not know much about Western Sahara. And so it's a responsibility as the solidarity movement to raise. It's not only about Palestine, it's not only about Western Sahara, or that it's our responsibility to conscientize the world about other oppressed nations across the world.
Exactly.
And lead that. Do you have a position on Swaziland, Comrade Khalid?
On Swaziland, yes. It's very good that you've asked, because, I mean, we need to be found in central, actually, in terms of championing the struggles on the African continent. We need to be. In fact, the Swaziland as well, I can point to Congress resolutions of the ANC Youth League. Even in our province, we were critiqued at some point, but we hosted also leadership of Podemo. We had seminars with leadership of Podemo in our province as well, and of I think it was the Communist Party of Swaziland at the time. And we're in regular contact with leadership. So our position is very clear in terms of Swaziland, that the current actions and activities by Mswati the Third, I think it's Mswati the Third, if I'm not mistaken, are complete. It's a complete violation of human rights. There's an abuse even of culture, which are actually, some of them actually new creations which the king has put in place to amass wealth, to partake in the most corrupt activities as possible, and to suppress any critical opposition to that. So we stand actually with Podemo, but also with the youth, because I've noticed there's an increase in young people rising up against the regime. So we fully oppose what the regime is doing. There needs to be greater sense of democratization, and with that, the wealth of Swaziland, the wealth of the country, the resources of Swaziland needs to be utilized for the benefit of the majority of Swazi people. And people must not be crushed because they are speaking out against the corruption that's happening. And in fact, let's be honest here, the colonial powers have also been protecting the royal monarch. They've been protecting, there's nothing there for them about human rights when it happens in Swaziland. So we need to be, and I think we must even be prepared to consistently be critical even of our own government on the issues around Swaziland. We must not be backtracking all the time and saying, no, there's this family link, these ones assist. That is why I came to the issue when you spoke about the issue about people assisted us during the struggle for democracy. Because it's often argued that no, but this family assisted. There was assistance. Comrades could go there. There was this. But does it make what they are doing to their own people who also assisted us, who are also in the trenches with us, does it make it correct for them to do what they are doing and for us to turn the blind eye? No, certainly not. They are neighbors. We cannot. We need to make sure that that we are consistent in taking up the Swazi struggle, and we continue to speak truth to power even internally on that matter.
I think it's important to emphasize charity begins at home.
Indeed.
And we have a lot of Swaziland comrades who are exiled in South Africa. They can't go back to their homes. And we have many in the Youth League there, because they have double citizenship, others. Yeah. They are members of the AIDS Youth League, others who simply cannot go back to their families back at home because the Swazi regime, the King Swazi regime, has exiled them. I think it's important for that, and I appreciate from one activist to the next, I appreciate the support that the Youth League is showing to Swaziland. Going further,
I think we can ramp it up and do a bit more, though. I do think we should do a bit more and we should ramp it up.
Of course. I'm going a bit abroad. You were talking about the global south and international forces. We've seen what's been happening in Venezuela, sadly, for quite some time now. The regime change program from Donald Trump and his imperial government. You're very vocal on that. Many of your leaders have been went to Venezuela in the recent past. Would you tell us a little about that?
No, we've been very vocal on the issue of Venezuela, even before the Trump machinations. The support for the revolutionary movement led even by Hugo Chavez, it's been there from that time already. Because Venezuela, firstly, beyond the system that it's implementing in its own country, Venezuela has stood out as a beacon of hope in the struggle for a just world. From the time of Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez, when it came to the Palestinian struggle, very, very clear. When it came to speaking out and standing up against imperialism in the Middle East, on the African continent, Chavez was very, very clear. Even in Latin America, a great ally to the Cuban nation as well, a friend of the African National Congress. We've also had interactions with the youth movement there as well. Because also, but very importantly, what the triumph of that revolution showed, and its survival in spite of the pressures that the West is placing and the aggression, is that the system implemented, the socialist system, is a system that can work. They've shown it that it can work. Despite the propaganda that's being put out there, that it's a failure, it's a failed state, there's that. There was a bravery on the part of Chavez and then Maduro to actually stand firm and to implement a particular system and an economic system that's people-centered, that's more egalitarian, that actually speaks to the real material conditions of the poorest of the poor and of the working class, despite global capital and what it's trying to do. So in that respect, we see it as a responsibility to protect the government of Venezuela, because it's a revolutionary government, and because the more Venezuela fails or is forced to fail, or they're creating problems in Venezuela, the more the theory is continuing to be perpetuated that left movements cannot govern, that ideologies that are people-centered, that are not capitalist, that are not tied to the will of the imperialists, movements and governments that are internationalists are failures. So even at a symbolic sense, and for the rest of the global South, Venezuela becomes extremely important to protect. And so our position on Venezuela is that we completely oppose the US aggression. We completely oppose the propping up of puppet opposition in that particular country. Opposition that is run from the United States of America. And we actually welcome the fact that Venezuela has now told the US where to get off. They are working closely with Iran, for example, and looking at other sources of sustainability. So we must continue to support the struggle in Venezuela. We don't only owe it only to the current leadership of Maduro, but we owe it to the legacy of Hugo Chavez and the impact that he's had even on our thinking as young activists.
Thanks for that. I was going to ask about the historical relationship with Cuba, but in the intro you spoke quite substantively about it. I just want to bring it closer to home that on the Palestinian question, South Africa is seen as a moral leader on the particular question. Others have said that South Africa must play a mediatory role. Some on the other side, like ourselves, who are saying South Africa must play a more important role, that of boycotts, that of divestments, that of sanctioning the apartheid state. Do you think that South Africa is doing enough in this regard, in leading that particular discussion on solidarity with Palestine?
Look, I think South Africa as a whole, in terms of civil society, which can include the ruling party, which also includes government, inclusive of all of that, in the overall sense, South Africa is most certainly playing a leading role. Africa for Palestine forms part of that narrative as well. Even organizations that would feel that Africa for Palestine is maybe a bit too cozy with elements in government and in the ANC, and feels that it inhibits it from taking a more radical stance, even they are also part of that narrative broadly. So at a very broad, within even our own diversity, South Africa is most certainly playing a leading role, and the Palestinians recognize that. Even at the level of government, given, as I said to you from the onset, given the context, given where we're at currently, even our own economic situation, we're not saying it's ideal. Obviously, as the Youth League, given that we are radical and militant, we must push for more. Our approach should be more aligned to the Africa for Palestine approach, which is saying, look, be more firm in terms of boycotts, divestment, sanctions. Yes, talk about being part of the peace process and this, but peace process and negotiations, like for example Morocco, we are not opposed. I mean, even Polisario are focused now on going to negotiations. They're not into the armed struggle currently, but that has to come with pressure. We are saying let's be firm and aggressive in terms of exerting international pressure, so that when the Israelis go to the table, they are pressurized, and South Africa must be central in that regard. So yes, it's important. I think South Africa have taken quite progressive stances. We've had the issue even in the previous administration around the labeling issues of products. We've had the issue of the suspension, somewhat of diplomatic, not suspension of diplomatic relations, but the downgrading. We've had that. But I just think that what needs to happen is that maybe a little bit more needs to be done. I think we need to, even if it's purely going to be symbolic, and we know the Palestinians understand and appreciate South Africa's role, but I think a bit more sense of aggression is needed on the part of South African government regarding the Palestinian issue. I think we've done well. Let's use that basis to actually be a bit more aggressive. For example, I think we should actually reach a point here, simple issue, and this speaks to young people as well, people who have served in the Israeli Defense Force. They are mercenaries, they are criminals and murderers, and they should be treated as such in this country. Our law enforcement authorities ought to clamp down hard on them and make sure that they are arrested immediately. It must be criminalized to serve in something like the IDF. We are not saying, even if you say you still want to maintain diplomatic relations, which we also think maybe, I think at this point, perhaps South Africa should consider cutting diplomatic relations, even if it's just for a period of time. But the IDF issue, very, very clear. Even Israeli products, we should, I mean, it's simple. We should not be allowing Israeli products into the country. Yes, labeling was a good move, but products from the occupied territories and even products from Israel, because it's an apartheid state currently. So those are some of the simple things that I think we should be pushing much more harder on. We should be pushing, for example, also for Israel to appear as a war criminal, and that their leaders should go to the International Criminal Court. There's many things that we can be much more vociferous on, because sometimes I think we get caught up in the language of diplomacy. The international movements and the Palestinians themselves, when they supported us, they didn't get caught up in diplomacy. Yes, diplomacy is important, but they didn't allow it to define and to override the revolutionary responsibility that we've got.
Thanks. That was very comprehensive, I might say. And I feel like if anyone who's in government is listening to this can take the heads up that young people in this country are saying, we are giving you examples of what you can do. It's not only rhetoric and theory, we are saying you can do this.
And it's practical examples. What's not sad, but it speaks with is that we've sat physically in conferences. We've sat in Mangaung, we've sat in Nazareth, where we've painstakingly sat and worked out very, very practical resolutions of the African National Congress that can actually be implemented by government. Where BDS, we've talked about boycotting, divestments, the IDF issue. Many of these things are there in there. We're saying simply implement the ANC resolutions, finish and clear. Because if you are not comfortable with implementing it, then don't sit in conferences and accept it being adopted. Then we are using it. Then we are using it purely just to keep our friends internationally happy. We must not be dishonest. Yes, and many of those resolutions we've achieved, we've got them passed by the ANC with much internal resistance as well. If you've sat in the commissions, you will know. There were those, even amongst leaders and staffers and many people who were actually opposing many of the resolutions. But we've managed to achieve it. We've managed to get it pulled through. So it ought to resonate completely. It's practical, it's workable. If it was not practical and not workable, it wouldn't have passed the test of conference.
All right, Comrade Khalid. The Comrade Khalid is in Cape Town and knows this, the biggest march post, the biggest demonstration post apartheid. So in a democratic country, democratic South, the biggest protest was the 2014 protest in Cape Town, when Israel was relentlessly bombing Gaza. And those are some of the practical actions that South Africans are doing in terms of leading the narrative in Palestinian solidarity. It's not just rhetoric, it's not just webinars like this where we just speak and no action. So what would you say the youth of this country and many other youth across the world watching this webinar, what involvement can they do to pressure their organizations, to pressure their churches, their mosques, to pressure their trade unions, their political parties, their NGOs like this? What can they do to make sure that they can see these practicalities we're talking about? Young people can get involved in doing so.
No, definitely. In fact, young people, just to say and to start this final point on this, is to say that young people actually have a great ability to be the ones to actually do what you are just saying. Because if you look at even the struggles, Black Lives Matter, the environmental and climate change activism, the Me Too movement, many movements, even the struggle in Palestine, it's young people. Ahad Tamimi is a young person in Palestine, in our own country. So young people are at the forefront and at the cutting edge. We are, but what we need to do, I think, at a very practical level is firstly to ensure that in our organizations, in our churches, in our mosques, we are organized. We are united as young people. We don't allow petty things to divide us. The unity of the camp of the oppressed is very, very important, because many times in our solidarity movements, we allow petty things to get in our way, administrative control, this thing, this controversy, that controversy, and we lose sight of what we are trying to achieve. So we need to make sure and in fact, disunity and division is more found within progressive forces than amongst the right wing, actually, from what I've noticed. So we need to really guard against disunity and fragmentation. We're not saying we must all be the same. Let's agree on minimum program of action. Unite as young people in our formations. And I think we can definitely, the things that you have mentioned, so for example, in our churches, in our mosques, awareness. We start with awareness programs. Speak about Venezuela. Speak about even, and link it to the context within which you are in. So if it's a church or a mosque, many things which churches can do. Bring a delegation down or send a delegation to go and visit Bethlehem, for example. Speak about the similarities, the historical context, those winnables, those policies that I also spoke about, the IDF issue, campaigning against the use of security companies that are close to the Israeli government on our campuses, and on a very, very practical, let's look at very practical boycott issues that we can take up. And it can happen because, you see, even if we do it on a small scale, it works. It creates awareness and pressure is placed. And I think consistent, yes, marches are important. But COVID is happening now, so maybe that, I think, let's use forums such as these, the forums such as webinars. Let's write to the newspapers. Let's put pressure in terms of boycotts. Very, very important. Academic boycotts as well at institutions of higher learning. So there's a variety of ways which I have mentioned. I think it's going to be crucial. Get in contact, for example, with Africa for Palestine. Practical contact, because I know when it was BDS, there were many practical things. We could contact you guys even as a mosque, even as an organization, even as a gender rights movement, even as a school governing body, and say, come and do a workshop for us. And I think we must still be doing those type of things. Let's have a workshop. Let's see within our specific context, how can we best assist not only the Palestinian cause, but I think the cause of Venezuela, the cause in Swaziland, Cuba, various international struggles. We can do it.
Yeah, thanks, Comrade Khalid. So basically, if you have a WhatsApp group, you have a responsibility to tell them that you must help people of Swaziland. If you belong to a burial society, you must tell them that, hey guys, besides this, people in Palestine are suffering, they need our support.
There we go.
Young people have a responsibility to organize in their space, wherever they are. they need to organize on these particular issues. And I think it's important that you mentioned Black Lives Matter and other struggle. What we realized just during the apartheid struggle in South Africa ourselves, that struggles are intertwined. We knew that the apartheid government of South Africa was receiving arms from the apartheid government of Israel. So the Palestinian struggle and the South African struggle became one. So our struggles are intersectional. So if
exactly.
yes.
So even for example, young people are involved in service delivery protests and in championing issues of land, of housing. You will find that those people who are behind the scenes, those big businesses that are exploiting our people on the ground, that are wanting to use the land that our people ought to have, land that's there for housing, and wanting to use that for their big commercial establishments, many of them are sending money to the Zionist state of Israel. Many of those hell-bent on protecting white privilege in this country are the same people who are defending and protecting apartheid Israel. So there's intersectionality, clear intersectionality.
Thank you, Comrade Muhammad. We appreciate this conversation that you had with us, and this video will remain in the video section on our Facebook page for our viewers to interact with over time. We appreciate this, and we hope that people who are listening, people who are viewing this, can heed your advice, and we can do so much for a better world, for a more just world, for a more peaceful world beyond our own borders. Thank you for being with us today.
Many thanks, Comrade Ali, and many thanks to you as the host and to the organization Africa for Palestine for hosting me and for providing me that opportunity, because as we talk in these kind of conversations, our ideas also around activism tend to also be strengthened and more focused. So we thank you, and we want to wish Africa for Palestine all of the best in the struggle to create a more just social order.
Thank you, Comrade Muhammad.
Thank you very much.